Welcome back to Inside the System. I'm Jasmine Logan, and I'm joined by Emeritus Political Science Professor Dr. David Canervo. Today we'll be covering news in American politics relating to recent presidential campaign efforts, the aftermath of the hurricanes, and the latest assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. So stay tuned. There are only 19 days left until this year's election, so it makes sense that both of our presidential nominees have been ramping up their respective campaigns. Harris and Trump have been both reaching their audiences through rallies, interviews, and now their most recent podcast appearances. CNN's Hadass Gold reports.
With all of that said, let's get into it.
Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump have been racing to sit in front of the biggest podcast microphones.
Madam Vice President,
Alex,
welcome to Call Her Daddy.
it is good to be with you.
The newest media stars and their millions of listeners becoming some of the most important campaign stops.
This is going to be great.
I think so too,
Looking
Mr.
forward to
Trump.
this all my life.
As the media landscape shifts, so are the candidates as they scramble to target a younger and often hard-to-reach audience.
He knows you very well. He said, Dad, he's big.
Wow.
Yeah, big one.
That's cool.
So that's good.
What,
Well, that's where it is nowadays, right?
Trump has been flooding the podcast zone, focusing on platforms aimed at the right and white men, going on with Theo Vaughn, Nelk Boys, Logan Paul, Barstool Sports Bussin' with the Boys, and many others.
I like doing stuff like this, you know. I like it. I like conversation. I don't seem to get myself in much trouble. When she does it, every time she does it, they say she's stupid. She's stupid.
Meanwhile, Harris has been more selective, appearing on shows better known for their sex tips and celebrity gossip than news, like The Shade Room, All the Smoke, and most recently Call Her Daddy, where she talked about Trump's past comments on abortion.
Can you imagine? He is suggesting that women in their 9th month of pregnancy are electing to have an abortion. Are you kidding? That is so outrageously inaccurate.
Conversations on the podcast have a different approach than the traditional news sit-down, mixing in the lighthearted.
One of my guilty pleasures, especially when I'm on the road, are my Doritos.
Oh, what flavor?
Nacho.
Nacho.
Old school, original.
OG,
Come on.
yeah.
Along with the politics.
We can live with the marijuana. It's got to be a certain age. Got to be a certain age to buy it. It's got to be done in a very concerted, lawful way.
Although with little to no fact-checking or follow-up.
Pussycat. We were ripped off by every nation in the world, and some of the worst rippers were our so-called allies.
Podcasts have become a major part of the media diet for many Americans, with 2/3 of adults under 30 listening in the past year. And even though many don't go to podcasts for their news, they trust what they're hearing. A stunning 87% say they expect the information on their podcasts to be mostly accurate. The candidates are clearly taking this to heart, with Reuters reporting that Vice President Harris is in talks to sit down with the popular and powerful podcaster Joe Rogan. Trump also announcing earlier his own interview with Joe Rogan is in the works.
So, Dr. Canervo, podcasts and social media in general are center stage in this election cycle. Could the election content on social media influence voters?
Well, I think the social media material certainly could have an influence on the election. Mm-hmm. It strikes me as being kind of a niche sort of medium, and there are I think lots of people who listen to them, but there are also lots of people who don't listen to them. I must confess I'm not a podcast listener, and I don't know of anyone in my immediate circle who is. And maybe that's because old people are not familiar so much with that particular medium and that technology. But I suspect that younger folks are podcast listeners, and as a result may be influenced by them. And I think people with a particular ideology or a particular bent in the way they're thinking are fans of certain podcasts and their hosts and not others. And so it kind of depends on where you happen to fall.
Definitely. I do know that podcasts are a great medium for young adults. I mean, young adults under 30, the majority of them do listen to podcasts regularly. So I think that was an interesting campaign strategy for our candidates this election cycle. I mean, it definitely could reach some of those voters that might be on the fence and are younger, or maybe voting for the first time.
That's right. One of the things that political scientists and campaign managers have tried to do for a long time is to somehow reach the younger voter. And this is certainly one way of doing that, or at least trying to do that. The younger voter will be able to listen to these in his or her car, on the way to class, to work, whatever it might be, and find it a fairly easy sort of medium to attach themselves to. Older folks, not so much, as I said. But it's important to get the young voters out to vote and to try to bring them into the political system as much as possible. So I think podcasts are certainly a good idea and a good experiment to try to reach younger voters.
Definitely, and there are different social media platforms that play a role in that as well. Instagram, for example, someone might repost a presidential candidate's campaign ads. And I know for me personally, my TikTok is just a bunch of political news as well. So I definitely think there is an added level of exposure when it comes to social media and news and political content now.
Well, I think that's right. In a sense, they're kind of the 21st century technology that helps to replace newspapers and news magazines, which have fallen on hard times.
Definitely.
So, and of course, younger people are more active. They're not going to sit at home as much and read newspapers and magazines. And so it's a nice thing to have, technically, for younger people. And I think that it can have an influence on how they vote. It seems to me that depending on who the host is, and of course whether they select guests based on whether they're liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, young, old, or some other phenomenon or variable, then it seems to me that it'll attract a certain group of people. I suspect each host has their own set of groupies already. And so it's a matter of finding a particular person to invite onto the podcast that might appeal to their already established audience.
Definitely. And endorsements of public figures. I mean, Taylor Swift, for example, made an endorsement not too long ago, and that got loads of attention online, in the news, everywhere. So we'll see what kind of difference those types of endorsements and campaigning can make this election.
Right, and I might add quickly, and she also had the impact of getting people out to register to vote.
Very true. Another component, though, with political news being on the forefront of some social media platforms and podcasts is, in this digital age, misinformation and the spread of it has been increasing. And so I wanted to ask you, what are some ways that we can combat that?
Well, of course, combating misinformation is very difficult because today the sources act very professional, and in many ways it's hard to distinguish the professionalism of the news providers from CBS, NBC, CNN, from some of the other lesser known providers that are out there. And so I guess a couple of things that come to my mind is that it doesn't hurt, particularly if there's a piece of information that sounds a little strange or a little unusual, is to double check. try to check that information with another media source. If you hear something on CNN that doesn't sound right, check with ABC, NBC, CBS. What do they say about that same topic? If the same is true with Fox, if you hear something on Fox which sounds a little strange, check another network. Beyond that, it's a matter of looking at maybe other kinds of media sources. There's a website called Snopes, which is supposed to be a fact checker and to give you the real information about something that you can type in and double check on. So I would use that. And beyond that, it's just a matter of you perhaps using your own mind as well. When someone says, for example, that the weather is being controlled by a few people in Washington, D.C., that sounds a little improbable to me.
Just a bit.
And so I think everybody, students, adults, whoever it might be, have to use their own brain and think about what is a reasonable thing to have said about a particular activity.
Very true.
People should know that weather is not controlled by human beings at this point in our lives, and it was not a particularly fact-worthy thing to say.
Definitely. It's always very important to fact check and make sure that your sources are credible, and even check more than one source. Whether you get your information from social media or the news, it doesn't hurt to look into things on a deeper level. So do you think, with the potential influence that social media could have on this election, that might motivate more bans on certain platforms like TikTok, for example? That was a pressing issue not that long ago.
Well, I think it might. Of course, TikTok has some problems legally right now in this country because of its ownership by the Chinese. And the likelihood of TikTok lasting very long is not great right now. Other social media might find the same problem if, in fact, they are known for being tellers of untruths. If it's clear that much of what they say is false or questionable, then I think those media are going to be in jeopardy as well.
With the recent hurricane damages, the affected areas are having trouble bouncing back. For example, in Florida, they are out of disaster loan money for small businesses, fuel is running low, and hospital IV fluids are very limited. Let's take a closer look at what's been happening in the wake of Hurricane Helene and Milton. CNN's Amy Kiley reports.
After not one, but two recent hurricanes, the U.S. faces some shortages. The Biden administration is invoking the Defense Production Act because the nation's IV fluid supply is critically low. Its biggest producer is in hurricane-ravaged North Carolina. In Florida, officials say they're working with ports to restore the fuel supply.
We have now dispensed, just from the state, over 2.5 million gallons of gas free to the people of Florida.
Meanwhile, the Small Business Administration's disaster loan program is out of money. Officials say that's after about 49,000 recent applications. People can still apply, and Congress can approve more funds after its recess. FEMA says it has enough money for now, but
the ongoing spread of misinformation about operations is not okay. It has got to stop.
The agency says false rumors are making it harder to get relief funds to hurricane survivors.
We don't know how many people are not going to apply for FEMA because they have heard misinformation about FEMA taking their property or other wild accusations that are out there.
I'm Amy Kiley reporting.
There's no question that these hurricanes and their effects are tragic. But there's definitely some controversy on the root causes of these escalating natural disasters. So Dr. Canervo, do you believe these types of natural disasters are caused by climate change?
I think certainly climate change contributes to them. I can't say that there is a direct causal factor and that the hurricanes, for example, would not exist without climate change. We know that hurricanes have existed for decades, if not centuries. And so there are other causes, I think, initially for hurricanes and other storms, for example, tornadoes. But the scientists seem to argue, and I agree with them based on the recent evidence, that climate change and global warming seem to make those storms worse and perhaps a little bit more frequent. And what's scary about that for me is that it means that we're going to have more and more disasters, such as what we've seen in western North Carolina and East Tennessee from Helene. We're going to see more disasters as caused by Milton in Florida itself. And it's death, destruction, tons of money that are needed to rebuild, people's lives disrupted for months, if not years. And so it really is a very tragic thing that's going on right now. In many ways, you can't be safe anywhere. Beyond that, global warming is a real problem because a recent report that came out talked about how in certain areas of the earth, life is going to be very, very difficult to live because of either the heat, we've seen in Arizona, for example, 20 or 30 some days of over 100-degree weather.
Jeez.
I heard from a friend just today, in fact, that power was sparking in Arizona. When they dug down to the power lines, they discovered they had been melted by the heat.
Oh, wow.
Over the summer. We know that it's more difficult to grow certain kinds of crops as the weather changes. And so all of these things are leading to what some scientists are forecasting to be a real disaster as early perhaps as 26 years from now, 2050. I don't know that I will be here, but those of you will be here, I hope, and others, certainly our children and grandchildren throughout the world. And it's going to be a life which is going to be a very, very difficult one, potentially for them, because of the crop changes and food patterns, migrations from one place to another to escape the heat, the storms. It's not a very pretty picture.
No, not at all. And that is very concerning. And I mean, is it too late to do something about this?
Yeah, and you would think that we would come together as people to fight this thing.
Yeah.
But in fact, what the reports are saying is that such things as fossil fuels are continuing to be used at record levels, that we're not doing the kinds of things that we need to be doing. We are having more renewable energy, wind and solar, but it's simply not enough at this point.
That is very unfortunate to hear. Is there anything you'd like to say to viewers out there who still believe that climate change is not real, that question the scientific evidence?
Well, I would encourage them to look at many sources. I know that there are some politicians who tend to denigrate the notion that climate change is real, calling it a hoax. But in fact, scientists, and if you're a contemporary person, if you don't believe in science, you have a very, very difficult time in life, because that's where we get most of our information. So you've got to rely on reliable sources, multiple sources, which have a valid scientific background.
Definitely. All right, everybody. We'll be right back after this short break to talk more about the U.S. politics.
Hey, Bobo, do trees tell each other stories?
I'm sorry. I'm afraid I don't know that.
Hey, why don't we go find out? Listen.
Over the weekend, a man was arrested at a Trump rally in California for supposedly trying to assassinate former President Donald Trump. This would be the third assassination attempt on the former president this year, except there's more to the story this time. CNN's Kristen Drummond is bringing us that story now.
If the president was actually at risk, even if it was 1% of what they said is true, even 1%, I would still be in jail right now.
In his own words, Van Miller addresses his arrest and assassination attempt accusations against former President Donald Trump at a rally in California over the weekend.
I'm actually a Donald Trump supporter. I'm not an anarchist.
Are you here in Nevada or are you in California?
I would say I'm at an undisclosed location right now. I'm not in Nevada.
Miller says his car remains impounded. Authorities confiscating it after claiming to find guns, ammunition, and fake passports at a routine security checkpoint.
I roll down my window and I say, just out of common courtesy, I want to let you know that I have firearms in the car. Usually the police thank you and they love that you respect them enough to actually give them that common courtesy, right? In this instance, no, he asked me to pull over.
Miller sending a photo to News 3 of the citation. Police only listing 2 firearm violations. Nothing about fake IDs. Miller confirming police did find 2 passports in the car with different last names, one issued in the U.S. and the other in Canada where he was born. Court records in Nevada show Miller legally changed his last name in 2022. This followed using several last names over the years, including Yanofkin and Steinberg. Miller says he dropped the Yanofkin to run for state assembly in Nevada in 2022. The registered Republican lost his campaign.
I dropped the Yanofkin based upon the recommendation of 2 individuals that were high up within the Republican Party because nobody could pronounce my Armenian last name.
As for Steinberg, a document says Miller moved to the United States and was issued a passport with that name, even though it's not his legal last name. Miller says he used it to protect himself while covering war zones as an investigative journalist.
Through the passport office, again, lawfully, of course, and I explained to them, hey, I'm about to travel to these regions where my Armenian last name could get me killed. I want a last name that would actually not result in that.
Now he's working to clear his name and planning to take legal action. For News 3, I'm Kristen Drummond.
Since 1865, there have been a total of 14 assassination attempts on presidents and presidential candidates. 3 of those have occurred since the 2000s, and 2 of those have occurred this year. What do you think about the recent political violence, Dr. Conervo?
Well, of course, political violence and democracy are totally opposed to each other. You cannot have a well-functioning democratic government if people believe that political violence has merit and should be one of the tools that is used in government. It's just impossible. And so we need to do whatever we can to stop political violence from occurring in this country. It's anti-democratic in many ways. It not only changes leadership, as we've seen when those who are shot die, but it inhibits people from free speech because they're afraid. It may discourage them from certain jobs. There was talk that Colin Powell, for example, was somewhat hesitant to run for president because of the fear of violence, assassination. And so those sorts of things are just totally opposed to democracy and need to be stopped.
Definitely, I agree. What's concerning, though, is, with how polarized our country seems to be going into this election. After the 2020 election, for example, we had that insurrection at the Capitol. I mean, do you think following this election cycle, there could be more political violence?
Sure, there could be. Mm-hmm. If Trump were to lose the election, who knows what the Proud Boys and various other groups that he may have contact with will do. Mm-hmm. If he wins the election. There, of course, has been talk by him of retribution to his enemies.
Yeah, the enemy from within.
Yes, and we don't know exactly what that means or but that's a little bit frightening as well.
Definitely it is.
And so it's something to be concerned about.
I mean, I definitely find it concerning. I know Vice President Kamala Harris recently at a rally mentioned that statement that he said, the enemy from within. I think that type of language, or, language even that Vice President Kamala Harris has used herself, that, Trump is a threat to democracy. I mean, both statements on both sides could encourage some sort of backlash. So it's unfortunate that is a problem that we have to deal with.
That's right. We hadn't had that kind of polarization and infighting among Americans really since the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Only then did we see other Americans as the enemy.
Exactly.
And so we're unfortunately going back to that same rhetoric.
I hope, after this election, we as a country can move forward, because regardless of whether you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you're independent, we're all Americans, right? So we do have commonalities as just people on a human level, and I hope that we can, as a society, prioritize that and move forward peacefully. All right, and that's all the time we got for you guys today. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of Inside the System. See you next time.